The forks didn't simply fall. They struck the plates with a sharp crack, like something invisible had broken right there at the table. Even now I can hear it clearly, abrupt and final, as if the truth had finally forced its way into the room whether any of us were prepared for it or not. But that came later. At the time, it was just another Sunday dinner. I was raised in a quiet neighborhood just outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where neighbors wave from their porches, where Saturdays are for mowing lawns, and where families appear, at least from the outside, like they've figured everything out. My parents had lived in the same house for more than 40 years. My father, Harold Carter, was a retired machinist, solid, dependable, a man who believed your value was measured in hard work and steady income. My mother, Denise, had spent most of her life as a school secretary, organized, practical, always mindful of appearances, from the house itself to the family image. And then there was me. At 35, I was the one they couldn't quite place. No husband, no children, no home of my own. I lived in a small apartment across town and drove a car that looked older than it actually was. To them, all of that added up to one conclusion: I hadn't made it. That Sunday, I walked into their house carrying a store-bought apple pie, the same way I always did. My mother preferred homemade desserts, but I had stopped trying to impress her a long time ago. "You're late," she said, not harsh, but not warm either. "Traffic," I answered, placing the pie on the counter. My father was already at the table, flipping through the local newspaper. He didn't look up right away. That was his way. Acknowledgement came when he chose, not when you arrived. "Linda," he said eventually, folding the paper. "Sit down, dinner's getting cold." My older brother Mark was there too, along with his wife and their 2 children. Mark had followed the path my parents understood: stable job, mortgage, family dinners every week. He was the quiet standard I was always compared against. We sat together, passing dishes, exchanging small talk. The kids talked about school, my mother asked Mark about work, my father nodded along, offering occasional comments, and then, like always, the conversation found its way back to me. "So," my mother said as she sliced the roast, "how's your job going?" She always hesitated slightly on the word job, as if it were temporary or uncertain. "It's going well," I replied. "That's good," she said, though her tone carried doubt. My father leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You still working those odd hours?" "Yes, sir." He shook his head slowly. "I don't understand it. At your age, you should be settled, stable schedule, a real plan." "I have a plan," I said evenly. Mark gave a quiet chuckle. "Come on, Linda, you've been saying that for years." His wife glanced at him but stayed silent. I picked at my plate, choosing my words carefully. "Not everything looks the same from the outside." "That's exactly the issue," my father replied firmly. "We can't see anything. No house, no husband, no clear savings, at least none that we know about." My mother sighed. "We just worry about you, honey." "I know," I said, meeting her eyes. But it wasn't just worry. There was disappointment there too, and beneath that, something heavier: judgment. My father set his fork down. "If I'm going to be honest," he said, "if you keep going like this, chasing whatever it is you think you're building," he paused, then finished, "you'll always be broke." The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were new, I had heard versions of them before, but something about the certainty in his voice, the finality, cut deeper. Mark nodded slightly, as if it made sense. My mother stayed quiet this time. For a moment no one spoke. I felt that familiar weight settle in my chest, the urge to explain everything, to lay it all out in a way they could finally understand. But I didn't. I had learned long ago that some truths don't belong at the dinner table. Instead, I took a sip of water and set the glass down carefully. "I appreciate your concern," I said softly. My father frowned. "That's not what this is about." "I know," I replied. And I did. It wasn't just concern, it was belief, a deeply rooted idea of what a life should look like, and mine didn't match it. We finished dinner in a strained quiet. The kids eventually broke it with laughter over something small, and the conversations shifted away from me. But his words stayed. "You'll always be broke." After dessert, I helped my mother clear the table. She moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, rinsing dishes and stacking them neatly. "You know your father doesn't mean to hurt you," she said without turning. "I know. He just wants what's best." I dried a plate and placed it in the rack. Sometimes what people think is best isn't always right. She paused, then looked at me. "Then help us understand, Linda." I held her gaze for a moment. I thought about telling her everything, but then I thought about the years of assumptions, the quiet dismissals, and realized something. Understanding doesn't always come from explanation. Sometimes it comes from time. "I will," I said gently, "just not tonight." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't like that answer. When I left, my father was back in his chair watching television. He gave me a small nod. "Drive safe." "I will." Outside, the air was cool, early fall, the kind of evening that slows you down whether you want it to or not. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. My phone buzzed. A message, short and direct. 900 hours tomorrow, confirmed. I stared at it briefly, then locked the screen. "Yeah," I murmured. "Tomorrow." As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced once more at the house. Everything looked the same, but I knew something they didn't. By this time tomorrow, nothing would. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of what my father said, I had heard worse, but because I knew what the morning would bring, not just for me, but for them. I woke before sunrise, the way I always do. Some habits never leave. My apartment was quiet, small and plain. A single bedroom, an old couch, a kitchen that hadn't been updated in years. Nothing about it suggested authority or success. That was intentional. I made coffee the same way I always did. Black, no sugar. Then I stood by the window as the sky slowly shifted from gray to pale blue. Those early hours carry a kind of stillness, a clarity that disappears once the day begins. That's when I tend to remember. Not the big moments people expect, not ceremonies or recognition, but the quiet parts, the unseen ones. I joined the Marine Corps at 22. Back then, my father thought it was just a phase. My mother cried for weeks. Mark assumed I'd come back once I got it out of my system. I didn't argue with them. I never really did. Boot camp was the first time my life felt clear. Expectations were simple. You were either ready or you weren't. You either kept up or you fell behind. I didn't fall behind. I wasn't the strongest, I wasn't the fastest, but I was steady, focused. I listened more than I spoke. That mattered. Over time, I moved into logistics and financial operations, not the kind of work people imagine when they think of the military. No frontline stories, no dramatic tales, but it mattered. I handled supply chains, operational budgets, resource allocation across multiple units. Eventually, I was trusted with decisions that never left secure rooms. Numbers, yes, but behind those numbers were lives, missions, outcomes that reached far beyond spreadsheets. I learned to manage millions without error. I learned to stay calm under pressure. And I learned something else. You don't need recognition to do meaningful work. Still, there were costs. I missed Mark's wedding, both of my grandparents' funerals. Holidays spent overseas, calling home at odd hours, listening to conversations I was no longer part of. At first, my parents asked questions. Over time, they stopped. And in that silence, they started assuming that if I didn't speak about success, I didn't have any. Assuming that if my life didn't look familiar, it wasn't working. I didn't correct them. Partly because I couldn't. Some things weren't mine to share, but partly because I wanted something else. I wanted to be trusted without explanation. That trust never came. About 5 years ago, my parents hit a difficult stretch. Medical bills, financial strain. The house, their house, was suddenly at risk. I found out through Mark. "They'll manage," he said. "Dad always does." But I knew better. So I made a few calls, quiet ones, the kind that don't leave traces. Within weeks, part of their debt was gone. Not everything, but enough to give them space, enough to keep the house. My mother called me afterward. "You won't believe it," she said. "The bank made some adjustment. We don't understand it, but it helped." "I'm glad," I told her. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about it?" she asked lightly. I smiled. "No, ma'am." She laughed. "Well, whoever did it, they were sent by God." Maybe. Or maybe it was just someone who knew how to move things quietly. I never told them, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want gratitude to define how they saw me. I wanted something harder: respect. By the time I turned 30, I had reached a level most people spend their lives chasing, not publicly, not in ways that show up in everyday conversation, but in rooms that mattered. At 33, I was promoted. The ceremony was small, controlled, not something you invite family to. When it ended, one of my commanding officers shook my hand and said, "You've earned this, Colonel." Colonel. It didn't feel unreal because I doubted it. It felt unreal because I knew how little that word would mean to the people I cared about if they never heard it. So I kept living the same way. Same apartment, same car, same quiet visits home. Not out of resentment, out of patience. Because eventually, truth has a way of revealing itself. Not loudly, but clearly. I finished my coffee and checked the time. 7:15 a.m. Plenty of time. I got dressed in simple clothes, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, sharp enough to wake you fully. My phone buzzed again. Vehicle en route, ETA 0830. I slipped it into my pocket. Across town, my parents were starting their day. Coffee brewing, news playing, another ordinary morning. They had no idea. By mid-morning, they would, and for the first time, they wouldn't be guessing anymore. They would finally see what I had built, not because I told them, but because they wouldn't be able to miss it. And strangely, that truth didn't wound the room. It healed it, because everyone at that table knew we were finally saying the things we should have said years ago. We finished dinner more slowly after that, not because the conversation was over, but because it had changed. My father asked about my work, not details I couldn't share, but the kind of questions that mattered. What I was responsible for, how long I had served, what kind of people I worked with, whether I was proud of what I had done. That last question stayed with me. "Yes," I said, "I am." He nodded, and this time there was no hesitation. "You should be." For a long time, that was all I had wanted. Not admiration, not shock, just that. When I left that evening, my father walked me to the door. He rested one hand on the frame and looked at me with a seriousness I recognized from childhood. "I can't undo the years," he said. "No, sir, but I can do better with the ones we have left." The words caught somewhere deep in me. I gave him a small nod. That would mean a lot. He opened the door, then stopped me one last time. "Linda?" "Yes. I'm proud of you." It was simple, late, a little rough around the edges, and real. For the first time in years, I drove home without feeling like I was leaving something broken behind. A few weeks later, we were back at the same table. Same house, same chairs, same Sunday evening, but nothing felt the same. It's strange how a place can stay exactly as it is, yet feel completely different once something inside it shifts. My mother had made roast chicken this time. The windows were cracked open just enough to let in a soft, early autumn breeze, the kind that carries the faint smell of leaves starting to turn. My father was already seated when I arrived, but instead of waiting for me to come to him, he stood. Not formally, just intentionally. "Linda," he said. "Dad." There was a pause, not awkward, just aware, and then he pulled out a chair for me. It was a small gesture, but I noticed, and so did my mother. Dinner began the way it always had, but the rhythm was different. Slower, more thoughtful. No one rushed to fill the silence, but no one avoided it either. My father asked me how my week had been, not in the usual way, not as a passing question, but like he actually wanted to hear the answer. It was busy, I said. We're preparing for a transition period. A lot of moving parts, he nodded, leaning forward slightly. Logistics? He asked. I allowed myself a small smile. Yes, sir. He sat back, absorbing that. I've been reading a little, he said, about how the military handles supply and finance. It's more complicated than I realized. That's one way to put it, I replied. My mother glanced between us, something soft in her expression. I told him the same thing, she said. He's been asking questions all week. My father gave a short breath through his nose, trying to catch up. There was no embarrassment in it, just effort, and effort at this stage in life means something. Mark and his family arrived a little later. The dynamic shifted again when he walked in. He wasn't unkind, but he was unsettled. I could see it in the way he looked at me, like he was still trying to fit new information into an old picture. Hey, he said. Hey. We hugged briefly. His kids ran past us into the living room, chasing each other with the kind of energy only children have. Dinner continued. At some point, Mark leaned back in his chair and said, "So, Mom told me." I met his eyes. He gave a half smile. About you not being broke. It wasn't a joke, not really, but it wasn't unkind either. Yeah, I said. He shook his head slightly. All this time, he said, I thought I was the one doing everything right. I didn't answer because this wasn't about comparison, and I think somewhere deep down he knew that too. I guess there's more than one way to build a life, he added. That's true, I said, and that was enough. After dinner, we didn't rush to clean up. We stayed at the table, talked, not about surface things, but about real ones. My father asked me about my early years in the service, what it was like starting out, what I struggled with, what kept me going. My mother asked about the places I'd been, not the classified details, but the human parts, what the people were like, what I missed the most when I was away. And for the first time, they listened without trying to translate my life into something they already understood. They let it be what it was. That's a rare thing and a valuable one. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the house settled into that quiet that comes after a full day, my father and I ended up on the back porch. We used to sit there when I was younger, back when conversations were simpler. He rested his arms on the railing, looking out at the yard. I've been thinking, he said. That's usually a good sign, I replied lightly. He gave a faint smile. I spent most of my life believing that if something didn't look familiar, it probably wasn't right. I didn't interrupt. But the truth is, he continued, the world changed, and I didn't keep up with all of it. He glanced at me. And you found your place in it anyway. I nodded slightly. I tried. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. You didn't need us to understand you to succeed, he said. No, sir, but you deserved it anyway. That landed deeper than anything else because it wasn't about the past. It was about recognition, present, real. I took a breath. Thank you. We stood there for a while after that. No pressure to say more, just understanding. When I left that night, my mother hugged me at the door. She hadn't done that in years. Not like that. Tight, steady, no hesitation. I'm proud of you, she said. I know, I replied softly. My father didn't hug me. That wasn't his way. But he put his hand on my shoulder as I stepped outside. Drive safe, he said. I will. Same words as before, but they meant something different now. On the drive home, I thought about everything that had happened. Not just the bank, not just the reveal, but the weeks after. Because that's where the real change lives. Not in the moment people find out who you are, but in how they choose to see you after they do. My parents hadn't become different people overnight. They were still who they had always been. But they were open, willing to question their assumptions, willing to listen, willing to admit they had been wrong. And at their age, that's not easy. It's not something everyone does. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's this. Success doesn't always look the way people expect it to. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's built in places no one else can see, and sometimes the people closest to you are the last to recognize it. But that doesn't mean it isn't real, and it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Because in the end, recognition isn't what defines your worth. Character does, consistency does. The choices you make when no one is watching, those matter most. If you're listening to this and there's someone in your life you don't quite understand, a son, a daughter, a friend, someone whose path doesn't look the way you expected, take a moment, ask, listen, because you might be standing in front of a story you haven't taken the time to hear yet, and by the time you realize it, you don't want it to be too late. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone or something you've been carrying, I hope you'll share it, or simply sit with it for a while. Sometimes that's enough.